keep up their demands as talks with the government are postponed. Haitians continue pressuring President Jovenel Moise to step down. And voting wraps up in Tunisia's presidential runoff elections. Hello and welcome to Telesur. I'm Doris Polo in Quito, and this is From the South. A day after mass protests and fierce repression rocked the capital, Ecuador is anxiously waiting for talks with the government. The center of the city is strewn with debris after the police launched hours of attacks on protesters on Saturday. Leaders of the main indigenous organization, CONAIE, were expected to meet government representatives at 3 p.m. local time, but the meeting has now been postponed. We are waiting to hear details of what will happen next. They were being mediated by the UN office in Quito and the Ecuadorian Bishops' Conference. Some protesters gathered again in the area of the National Cultural Center where the indigenous movements have set up their base. A curfew imposed in Quito on Saturday afternoon was lifted until 8 p.m. at night. Ahead of the talks, many protest leaders insisted that the government must withdraw its austerity package.
At 3 p.m. we will all gather in the cultural center and wait, because we are determined that this decree must be withdrawn. Only then can we talk about peace. If not, from tomorrow our strike will be a strategy. We have lost a lot of lives. We have many people injured. We call on everyone to be united and attentive at 3 in the afternoon to the national broadcast when there is the meeting with the United Nations and the government. If the decree is reversed, then we can all go home peacefully. After all this pitched battle that you can see behind me.
As protesters waited for the talks, the police again began firing tear gas at those gathered near the National Cultural Center. Our correspondent Denise Herrera was there.
Hello, we are at the 6th Avenue, one of the main avenues of Quito, and we can see how the police repression is starting now against the demonstrations who are joined to the 11th day of the strike against the economic measures announced by President Lenin Moreno. Meanwhile, the main members of the Indigenous movement and the government will hold a meeting and they will discuss the current situation of Ecuador. And it's important to say here that the Indigenous movement said that they want to stop, that President Moreno had to stop with the economic measures.
Now, after the curfew was imposed on Saturday, indigenous protesters in El Arbolito Park say that the police on horseback chased them to a nearby university firing tear gas. However, the military did not appear.
We also want to have a life. We need air to live. We're all hungry. We all have needs. They can maintain their lives thanks to the people in the countryside, because all their products come from us. They might be millionaires, but they can't eat their money if our products stop coming from the countryside.
Medics treating injured protesters are calling on the government to realize that the entire country is rising up, not just the indigenous population.
The only thing that we ask from the government is to be aware of the fact that not only the indigenous people but the entire country is rising up. They need to put capable people to represent them. We are health workers, we are impartial, but we are also human beings. We are seeing things through the eyes of the vulnerable, those who are risking their lives. We have treated people with all sorts of injuries, cuts, blows on the head, and the most serious we sent to the hospitals.
And Carla Gonzalez joins us to discuss the situation as it relates to talks that are yet to take place between the government and the Indigenous Federation. Now, Carla, the Ecuadorian government has agreed to hold a first round of talks with indigenous groups in the country this Sunday evening in the capital, Quito. Tell us exactly what's coming up with these talks.
So yes, we were expecting today, as of 3 p.m. local time, the government to agree to talk with several leaders of the indigenous movement in Ecuador. Both sides were not giving up on their own demands. The government did not take back the measures, the economic measures that were imposed, and the indigenous leaders were not intending to begin a dialogue with the government, because they said that if the repression continues and the measures are not taken back, they will not go into talks. We have just new reports from our team that went to these dialogues, which were supposed to start and had been taken over some time, and they were the only team. Our team in Telesur was the only team that was not allowed to enter these talks. It had been a couple of hours since it was announced that the talks were happening, but our team there, our cameramen and our reporters on the ground, were the only ones that were not allowed to enter the talks. We assume it is happening at the moment. We have no form to confirm this information because most of the media that are already in place, where their signals were inhabited, they couldn't talk, they couldn't call, they couldn't broadcast anything, audio or photos or video. Video was the only, of course, one of the forms that were not allowed to be broadcasted. And so we resumed our information that Telesur was the only media that was not allowed to enter the talks, the very important talks that were supposed to be held today. And of course, this follows that our signal, Telesur's signal in Spanish, was eliminated from one of the TV companies, one of the biggest TV companies in Ecuador, since we were the only reporters on the ground yesterday that were reporting on how police were repressing some of the protesters that were on the streets very close to the National Assembly. So we are waiting for an official confirmation by any of the official actors on this dialogue. We have to remember that the government had offered to broadcast the talks live on live TV, but this is not happening since we are not able to be there and we are not receiving any signal at the moment. Just to look back on what's happening today in Quito, today we don't have a curfew for the hours until 8 p.m. From 11:30 a.m. until 8 p.m. we had a temporary block of this curfew that we had from yesterday at 3 p.m. So it's almost a day since that happened. But the curfew that does continue is the one that from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. in the morning, people are not allowed to be close to key buildings that belong to the government, for example, the National Assembly and the police, the government palace, the Palacio de Carón de Led, which is where for years has been the power, the center of power, the political power in Ecuador. And also all the streets around those are still in a special curfew that the armed forces announced that will continue in place.
So Carla, can you tell us who exactly are taking part in these discussions?
So, as we know, in Ecuador, we have several indigenous communities from the coast, the highlands, and even the Amazon area. And some of the leaders of these communities have come together and said that they will go into talks with the government. That does not mean that all of the indigenous organizations that are part of this protest are there to talk with the government. As we told you, for example, Jaime Vargas, the president of the CONAIE, the Confederation of all the national associations of indigenous people in Ecuador, is not going to this dialogue. And also to include in this report that we don't know where President Lenín Moreno, is at the moment. We don't know if he is part of this talk because we remember that when he offered to have a dialogue with the indigenous communities so that they will stop protesting on the streets, President Moreno offered a direct dialogue with him. And he had to repeat this twice. And this is not a joke. He said it, I repeat, a direct dialogue with me, which is what the indigenous leaders had expected. But we haven't seen him in any of the dialogues, and he hasn't even spoken about the possibility of him being at the site. We also have to remember that even though there's 3 or 4 indigenous organizations that are part of this dialogue, they are not the complete organization that is taking the marches to the streets. We have also campesinos, students, feminist organizations, which is, it makes it now a popular organization, a popular march. It's not just an indigenous march. And of course, it hasn't even stopped being about the transport, because we have to remember that when it began more than 10 days ago, it began as a transport paralyzation, meaning that buses and taxis in Ecuador were not working. Now it has become an even larger manifestation.
Thank you so much, Carla, for providing us with an update on the ongoing talks as protests continue in Ecuador against President Lenin Moreno's austerity measures. Let's take a look at how the protests against President Moreno's measures have developed on this 11th day of the national stoppage. Estefania Bravo reports.
The streets of Ecuador's capital, Quito, have changed dramatically in the last few days. After Saturday's fierce repression, some citizens have again left home to protest against the economic measures of President Lenin Moreno. And the Indigenous movement and other organizations remain outside of the National Assembly and the El Arbolito Park to demand that the government revoke its IMF austerity package.
We have lost fear. We're here because we're not afraid anymore. We do not agree with the decisions taken by President Moreno, and that is why we're here. And we will continue to be here no matter what happens. If the government doesn't yield, neither will we. The security forces, like the army, should join the people that are here.
This Sunday, the first talks are taking place between the government of Lenin Moreno and the leaders of the indigenous movements. But some protesters say they don't expect much from the talks, and those leaders don't represent them.
Unfortunately, President Moreno has only met with certain leaders of the indigenous movement. They are not real leaders. They are not the ones that had been murdered by the police, the ones that had been beaten up. It is just one group that is sitting at the table. It is not the people. If they come to an agreement, it will be between them and not with us.
It is not just indigenous movements that have taken to the streets, but people from all sectors throughout the country. They are on the streets fighting for peace.
I'm here for peace. We are killing each other among Ecuadorians. I know that everything is bad, but we need to come to an agreement because there is a lot of violence. Our indigenous brothers are dying. Policemen are also dying. We ain't the president to take decisions. People want peace. I come from Manabí, from Chone. We want peace between Ecuadorians. This is not a war. That is why I am here.
Many say that Ecuador has changed for good in just a few days. Today, protesters are playing music and singing. Even in the middle of so much pain, they have been able to find some peace and joy.
We move now to the Caribbean. Tensions remain high in Haiti with anti-government protests continuing in the capital. Demonstrators rallied on Sunday, heightening their calls for President Jovenel Moïse to step down amid chronic food and fuel shortages. Protesters have faced heavy police repression. Police fired tear gas to stop a crowd from marching to the president's home on Saturday. At least 17 people have died and 200 others have been injured as a result of month-long protests. Recent demonstrations have been inflamed by the killing of a prominent journalist who had been covering the protests. Changes will likely be made to electoral districts and constituency boundaries in Trinidad and Tobago ahead of local government elections. This after the lower house passed a motion to approve the Draft Elections and Boundaries Commission Order 2019. The order announced the creation of new districts. It also saw specific changes to boundaries, including 3 districts in San Fernando, 2 in Chaguanas, and 9 in San Juan Lavantil. The changes apply to areas in municipal corporations controlled by both the ruling party and the opposition. Over the next few weeks, both parties are expected to intensify preparations for local government polls, which will be held on December 2nd. And as TNT gets into election mode, legislators are still to vote on another bill that seeks to amend sections of the law pertaining to local government elections operations. The local government reform bill requires a simple majority vote and so can be passed by government votes alone.
The main stakeholders, and from that we will be going to get the summary of it, and then we are going to go to the parliament back to do clause by clause. And that should be close to just after the budget. But it will be before the elections.
Coming up, Bolivians will head to the polls in 1 week and President Evo Morales is so far expected to be re-elected. Join us again in a minute.
A review of the world news that investigates, incites analysis and induces criticism, because every event has a context.
Pusimos el punto en la I.
Dotting the I. Saturdays, only on Telesur.
Welcome back. There is just a week to go until Bolivia goes to the polls to elect its next president. President Evo Morales remains the favorite to win re-election, but the opposition is already calling foul.
The candidates for president and vice president of Bolivia are into the final stretch of their campaigns with just a week to go before the election. The candidates and their parties have already been closing their campaigns in different departments of the country. The final campaign close will be on Wednesday, after which reporting restrictions come into force. The Electoral Court says the lead-up to the election has gone smoothly and that more than 100 international observers have been arriving. However, the political opposition has restarted its campaign against the electoral process itself. At rallies in La Paz, Cochabamba and Santa Cruz, they repeated their demand for all the members of the Electoral Court to stand down. They say they will not recognize the candidacies of Evo Morales and Álvaro García Linera, and they will not recognize Evo Morales' victory if he wins. The political opposition includes all the extremes of right and left, but it is represented by 8 different candidates in this election because the different parties couldn't agree on a single candidate to challenge Evo Morales.
That was our correspondent Freddie Morales with that report. A caravan of roughly 2,000 African migrants are marching to Mexico's capital to demand President Andrés Manuel López Obrador help to get them out of their legal limbo. The migrants, many of whom have risked their lives to try to get to the United States, have been stuck in southern Mexico. They are stuck because Mexico has denied them the travel visas necessary to proceed north, but Mexico is under pressure from the U.S. to stem the tide of migrants. Activists marching in solidarity with the African migrants say many have fled violence, persecution and poverty, ethnic and religious strife and political repression back in their homelands. 63-year-old Nona Akwan has been inaugurated as Trinidad and Tobago's new Carib Queen, the leader of the country's indigenous community. Akwan is not only the leader of the First Peoples, but she will also head the Council of Elders of the Santa Rosa community. The esteemed title, established in 1875, is based at the Santa Rosa First Peoples community in Arima, and the position is a lifetime appointment. The use of Carib in the title Carib Queen is meant to represent all people of indigenous Amerindian descent in Trinidad, rather than referring specifically to ethnic Caribs. The First Peoples community had launched the process for electing a new queen following the sudden passing of the late Queen Jennifer Cassar. We'll take a short break now. When we return, a typhoon has caused catastrophic damage in Japan, killing at least 14 people. Details after this.
We are present at every event where our nations are staring. We believe in a new global vision, united in every broadcasting. We keep expanding our horizons and working on a closer and better communication. Now, in Grenada, Telesur, the news source from South America and the Caribbean.
Welcome back. Tunisians have voted in a presidential runoff that will see either a conservative academic or a media magnate fresh out of jail heading the country. Both candidates are political newcomers. Whoever is elected president will have to tackle a stagnant economy, high unemployment and poor public services following the 2011 Arab Spring. Presidential candidate Nabil Karoui was released from prison on Wednesday after spending over a month behind bars on suspicion of money laundering. The other contestant, K. Said, a constitutional law expert, has defended the death penalty, criminalization of homosexuality, and a sexual assault law that punishes unmarried couples who engage in public displays of affection.
The Tunisian people has created a new meaning for revolution in the context of legitimacy in accordance with the law, and will ensure that the law is respected. The Tunisian people has surprised the whole world. It has surprised sociologists and political scientists, and it will make its will a reality.
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has declined to say whether Northern Ireland will stay in the EU customs union after Brexit. Johnson and Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar held talks last Thursday in a bid to get a Brexit deal before the October 31st deadline.
Well, I can certainly tell you that under no circumstances will we see anything that damages the ability of the whole of the United Kingdom to take full advantage of Brexit, and I think that's what people would expect, and that's what I think we can achieve. But the best thing now really would be for the negotiators to get on and do their job.
Just one last try on Brexit. Can you tell me categorically that Northern Ireland is leaving the EU customs union?
I think it would be wrong of me to give a running commentary on the negotiations, and why, with the greatest possible respect. I think look at everything that I've said previously. I think you can draw your own conclusions from that, but let's let our negotiators get on. I think where Leo Varadkar and I got to yesterday was a joint feeling that there is a way forward. We can see a pathway to a deal. That doesn't mean it's a done deal, so there's work to be done.
Shifting gears now, Typhoon Hagibis has made landfall in Japan, killing at least 14 people. The storm, with wind gusts of up to 216 kilometers per hour, smashed into the main Japanese island of Honshu around 7 p.m. local time on Saturday. Hagibis triggered deadly landslides and caused rivers to burst their banks in several areas, including Nagano. The government deployed 27,000 troops to aid rescue operations, including some in helicopters. Kenyan athlete Eliud Kipchoge has made history, breaking the mythical 2-hour barrier for a marathon. With 1 hour, 59 minutes and 40.2 seconds, the 34-year-old Olympic champion became the first ever to run an over 42 kilometers race in under 2 hours in Austria. The world marathon record has, for the past 16 years, been contested uniquely between athletes from Kenya and Ethiopia. The two nations are also fierce rivals for distance medals on the track.
From the first kilometers, I was really comfortable. I've been training for it for the last 4.5 months. And above all, I actually I've been putting in my heart and my mind that I want to run under 2 hours in marathon to make history and pass a positive thought and a message to the whole world that no human is limited.
World-renowned opera singer Jessye Norman, who died last week at the age of 74, was laid to rest over the weekend. While she may physically be gone, her legacy is set to live on among South African singers. Our correspondent Matuba Malachi spoke to South African opera singers who paid tribute to Norman.
Against all odds, Jessye Norman became an opera singer when it was still unpopular to do so for black people. While she was a brilliant artist, she was also an activist, and her work has inspired young opera singers like Luthando Qave, born and raised in South Africa, but currently singing on stages all over the world.
La piccina, 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 la piccina.
He sent this message from Sweden.
Her music and her interpretation of every piece that she sang was unmatched. She was an entertainer and also a perfect interpreter. She was incredible, and my favorite parts were always the German parts. Ariadne of Naxos to me has to be one of the best things she has sung. The Rückert Lieder by Mahler is one of the most beautiful things that I've appreciated about her. The way she carried herself and the way she had strength, to actually go through everything she went through.
Another South African opera singer who's enjoying a successful international career, Huitimang Lehobie, also studies at the University of Michigan in the US. She says she was inspired by the late Jessye Norman.
What an artist she was. She was absolutely amazing. And as a Black woman, she was my greatest inspiration. And a lot of my friends here, everybody was just like so drawn into her art and her artistry.
Western classical music is alive and well in South Africa, and there are still artists who keep it alive even under difficult circumstances. They too have sent their condolences to those who knew and loved Jessye Norman.
One marvelous thing about her was her interpretation of music. It was marvelous. Her sound was unique, not imitating anyone.
Jessye Norman is no more, but her indelible mark remains with generations to come of opera singers. Maduba Mahlachi, Telesur, Pretoria in South Africa.
And we now leave you with images of discussions between President of Ecuador, Lenin Moreno, and leaders of the main indigenous organization, CONAE, which is taking place just outside of Quito. Both are coming together to discuss amendments or adjustments, possibly to the austerity measures of President Lenin Moreno. And with that, we've come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telesur English, I'm Doris Polo. Thank you for watching.